That is a really tricky question. I think the first thing, I'm sure there are many things, but I think the first thing that does come to my mind is definitely the ocean. I think just being I really need the ocean in my life on an everyday basis, I feel. Because I think every time I go close to an ocean, the vastness is something that deeply inspires me. And also, it's so incredibly mysterious. And there is something about returning to the womb almost always whenever I dunk myself into the ocean, whether I'm just afloat on it, whether I'm sitting beside it, whether I'm like diving within it. There's just always so much of a holding that I receive. Being beside an ocean. So I think I definitely relate and find myself um, being inspired by the ocean on an everyday basis. Yeah. Wow. I think I've crafted my life largely around being surrounded by nature almost at all times. I think whether it's been in every part of life. So I think it's a big I can't even ever think of one space, but I think there is a recurring memory which I always return to, particularly because this landscape is now lost. It was growing up in the Aravallis, which is on the outskirts of New Delhi. It's one of the oldest mountain ranges, and I find myself returning to that in memory so often because it was like this dry scrub forest surrounded by dunes, and when you would look at it at first glance, you would consider it to be barren and dead. But my childhood was literally on this range, and spending so much time in it is what made me really realize that how deeply inspiring and full of life that habitat was. And it would like change every season, and because it's like a scrub forest is pretty much just barren land, right, which is like rocks and dry shrubs. But every season from winter to spring to summer to autumn, it would change and like bloom in gifts in new ways. And I think it holds a really deep space in my heart because today that entire region has been flattened in an urban metropolis, like an urban metropolis called Gurgaon has erupted over it. So when I return to it, it's just not there anymore. And it's funny because when I talk about it, I do wonder would people ever really relate to what I'm saying, because when what they will see today is just like this sprawling, really terribly planned city. But that's where my childhood was. We grew up around incredible wildlife. There were like nilgais and leopards and like moths and fungi, and just it was magic. And I think that's definitely, I think losing that and growing up with that is what has crafted my life entirely to chase that moment again. And it's sort of been like it's been a it's a part of my roots for sure, I think. I hope through these work process which I create that they can start looking at the world around them differently. And because the magic is right here, I always say it. It's not far away. It's not an illusion or a delusion. It's right here to be tasted and experienced. And it's a really potent, powerful tool, actually. And the day I realized that how powerful art is, um, I s- and how deeply I felt about so many things, be it like how the natural world is deteriorating, be it about gender, be it about sexuality, be it about politics. I realized that the best way to express myself is through the arts, and I could say so much more than what I could write or say. That it became like this journey almost, I would say, and which I'm still figuring out. I'm still discovering every day through a new medium, through a new portal, and it continues. Yeah. I think somewhere I just want the people who access my stories and my work to remember that everything that we seek is actually around us. It's not very far away. We sometimes have this idea like, oh, nature is somewhere far away from us, and I'll have to get myself to it. I must go on a holiday to witness it. I must take a break to find myself in like the space of like natural connection. And I was just like, no, it's right. Everything is right here. You just have to start looking at it. And that's what I guess my body of work has been trying to reflect over the past few years. So I think one thing that's I don't think I can name a person particularly, because I think being in India, what is truly inspiring is that we're actually surrounded by the arts almost everywhere, which is something, and I think that's what I realized, that we're absorbing so much visual language, from typography to murals to our textile to architecture to, and all of it, like, as you move from state to state, from town to town, it changes with new and new, more and more new things. And I was lucky enough to have traveled this country quite wide enough when I was really young, because my mom and dad were always fond of road trips, so we'd always be on the back seat, and we'd be going through different remote parts of this country. And I think I've been deeply inspired by the visual culture of what India has to offer, because it is so rich in storytelling, it is so rich in culture, it's so rich in like color, and such magical folklore that finds form in so many mediums, that even till date, when I find myself in places, just being in complete awe of this just this power of storytelling that we've been surrounded by forever, and I think that has definitely been a forever inspiration, I think, for me, to access. Yeah. I think that's how I grew up. So I always grew up telling stories of how I saw things in my head and how I saw the world through my own imagination. And as I grew up, I realized um, that I had extremely profound experiences with that just like shaped so much of who I am, like, because seeing my first shooting star, seeing, like I said, the first time you see clouds move, seeing like how trees sway to the wind, uh, I just realized that there is something so much more happening around us that we often don't see, because we're so busy in our own way of looking at things. And the way the world works is it often tells you to put on blinkers and not actually feel and see everything around you. And I think my blinkers got like taken off far too soon when I was really young. So both the good and the bad was really, really experienced through through just like wide eyes, whether it was like I said, whether it was sorrow, pain, joy. And I realized the one thing that was saving me through all of this was looking at everything with adding a story, adding a connection, adding like this sense of like surrealism to it. And looking at myself from an exterior perspective. So which is why, like, when I started building the worlds that I do, very often you'll see like they're really dense worlds that ask you to return again and again and again, because that's how I started seeing the world around me. Like, I was encouraged also to see things again and again. Nature taught me that so often, that, like I was speaking about the Ravlis where I grew up, where every season it shifted and became like this completely new place. And it was the same soil that was transforming again and again. It was the same tree that was transforming again and again. And within that, there were multiple realities. Like, what if I had only seen it one season? I would have thought it's probably like that throughout the year, but it wasn't. It would transform and become something every season, every day. And I think growing up, like I said, spending so much time in the natural world in very unique habitats, because even in the country that I live in, we have everything from the Himalayan mountain ranges to deserts to swamps to mangroves. I mean, to like horrific cities. We have the spectrum, and it's all here. All of it is here, and within that, there's suddenly these pockets that would open up with just like profound magic. Like, like I remember I was in New Delhi 2 years back, and it's a city that's like unfortunately like got the worst air. It's like terribly planned, but it's an incredibly biodiverse city. And I spoke to a friend of mine who was going on this mushroom fungi walk, and she'd been taking a lot of interesting pictures of fungi. So I wrote to her and I'm like, hey, I'm in the city, I don't know what to do. Can you take me for a walk? And she took me literally to this central forest called the Ridge, which is where I grew up, and we go for these morning forest walks. And I accessed that forest after 15 years of my life. And I entered that forest right after the rains had left. And it was blooming in the most unique kinds of fungi I've ever seen in my life. We spotted 72 species and things that I have like in one trek. And this is in the heart of a city that is like the most polluted city in the world almost. And I'm just like, what's going on? So the pockets of magic exist around us. We're not just one thing, we're so many things. And I think through these experiences where I realized that magic is right here, and that's how in my work I started accessing magical realism to tell stories. I always try and create from a space of joy and play. I think those are the things that I've always tried to root myself to, because I've never found myself um, attached to a particular medium. I'm constantly moving and like shape shifting between many things, and I think that is where the creative journey becomes exciting. And I think there's still so many mediums I want to try. Um, I've thoroughly enjoyed painting large scale murals. I've loved, like recently, in fact, I just so the illustration worlds I would create would usually be more like diorama based 3D, like almost like, when you look into the world, it looks like with a lot of depth and there's so much happening. And I was itching and I was being like, you know what, I'm tired of seeing these as 2D images. I want to actually see these worlds where I can move things and get into them. And very recently, I actually have an exhibition coming up next month. And I've made like my own like how I craft worlds into dioramas and automaton puppets where now you can move all the creatures. It's always incredibly exciting to keep like shifting and playing. I think the act of being playful with what you make is so important. Last month I just tried ceramics. Now I'm making like a whole fungi universe out of ceramics. So I think I constantly play with things. I think different mediums call you at different points in time. Different stories call different mediums. Sometimes you want to interpret something through uh through play or through like dioramas or like through film, through photography, a book. So I think that's what's been extremely exciting. I've been very fortunate enough to continue my play, I think, and experiment constantly with what can be made. And I think because I'm not like medium bound, my I think my well is mostly the stories that I actually marinate myself in. That from there I derive, okay, this is what I'm experiencing, this is what I want to share, and then I try and search for a medium for it. So it's almost like looking at an infinite universe, where I don't even know what all I'm going to try in the future. So it's exciting. I like that sense of infiniteness, I would say, where anything can come up. And I like putting myself in scenarios where I don't know much, and I have to learn new things. I think that student in me is always alive, and I love placing myself in that position as an artist always. Yeah. For the past 4 years, it's been incredibly challenging and extremely like a deep dive into learning so much about the world that we live in, and how we really interact with this world, and what is the role of arts in citizenship and policy making and crafting the future and actually safeguarding the rights for forests, for people. It's just expanded my world beyond belief. And it's been such a source of learning that I truly believe that artists in my generation should be getting more involved with spaces that allow them to exercise their creativity in these spaces, where you are actually engaging with architects, scientists, engineers, policymakers, law, and how can we collectively envision a future together that looks at how we imagine our forests, our cities, our urban spaces, what can they become? I think this is the time where we all need to collectively think and not just think in our little bubbles, but actually bring it to the forefront, because that's what we're missing, right? When we see laws passed, when we see definitions passed of how the natural world is being defined, it's like so capitalistic even today. Everything is looked at as an economic resource. Every connection to the natural world is a very give and take. There is, that spiritual connect to the forest is just slowly dying, which is what I come back to again and again. We all have facts, we all have numbers, we all have economics added to the natural world, but that's not it. It's definitely not it. There's so much more that particularly the creative community, I feel, can bring to this entire narrative that can reshape how we're looking at ecology. And yeah, so I think that is something that we're 4 years down, and we're always going to be here. So it's been a very deep learning experience of my life that's shaped my entire practice. Like it's definitely changed how I make art today in the world, which is a true gift, I think. The science and the arts are very interesting because we have very similar methodologies of how we look at the world, how we research, how we take notes. There's a lot of similarities in our methodologies, but our outcomes are entirely different. And I think being somebody who was particularly always very active, we were always encouraged to be very politically involved as children as well, in in law and politics and like in forest rights and people rights and all these things that I realized that I could start sensing a gap that, here was all this amazing knowledge sitting with these incredible people who spend their lives researching and studying communities and people and the natural world. But it was just like it was just stuck there. It was not finding a way, seeping itself out into the world where people who did not know about nature, they had no idea what the hell these people were talking about. And that's where I realized that positioning myself as a creator became incredibly exciting because I was interested in the knowledge by as a knowledge itself, but I was also interested in the act of making something that's rooted in knowledge as well. So I think that was something that was just so fast. And when I started working on a few projects, like I just did this very interesting project with Science Gallery and Technology for Wildlife in Bangalore, which is looking at this entire exhibition was planned around carbon and understanding carbon. And carbon is such a complex thing to like understand. How do you interpret carbon? Like, how do you understand what carbon is? What is so I was just like, wow, how am I going to do this? And then so I work with Technology for Wildlife, which was this amazing foundation based in Goa who's been doing a lot of cartographic work to look at multiple ways of studying the shifts in the natural world. And we actually looked at mangrove ecosystems and how they are like incredible carbon sinks. So then I sort of worked on a whole project around like how do mangroves function? What is the mangrove universe offer to the world? What are the relationships tied to mangrove ecosystems from the fishing communities to like the incredible biodiversity that's held within the mangrove ecosystem? So then understanding the biodiversity that's like functioning within these spaces, and then looking at policy and law that's just like constantly wiping out mangroves every day. And then we have almost all Indian cities are flooding. Even currently, right now, we're in the midst of the monsoon and we're facing floods in possibly every part of the country. And here you have like this incredible research understanding ancient relationships tied to these forests completely negated because there's just nobody talking about it or there's just no interest in it. And that just became really interesting for me. Like I said, like enter these spaces and then find places where we can sort of bring this knowledge, talk about this knowledge, create spaces to have more conversations on the importance of particularly mangroves in this context. And like there have been multiple projects, so I think every day I'm trying and finding new paths and routes that can connect science, arts, indigenous knowledge, policy making into this one mishmash that can come out through storytelling. And then I hope it does its own magic in the world, because then you have to just like throw it out in the world and see where it goes. It's really exciting. So it's called I still have to title it because I struggle with titling with my works, but it's currently like the tentative title is called The Hidden Worlds of Mumbai. And it's basically based around similar narrative of what I was saying. Bombay is such a sprawling urban metropolis that you imagine that what does this city contain? It's like it's infrastructurally crumbling. It's incredibly polluted. It's now got terrible air. The water is in like horrific state, and the city is constantly yet expanding. But within all this like mess, it is thriving with some of the most unique biodiversity that one can ever imagine. From like having leopards in the midst of the city to having like incredibly rare migratory birds arriving into the city to like having ancient tide pools that sprawl across the coast that like there are dolphins still in the water. And it's not like this is some like magical universe that's just brewing on its own. It's happened because of a lot of encroachment, a lot of habitat fragmentation, a lot of like a lack of understanding of how to plan a city that is surrounded by really rich biodiversity. But through this world, I'm trying to create like these three portals, which are these dioramas and automaton puppets, which look at three universes of the ocean, of the avian world, and an insectorium that sort of like is sort of like a little gift for the people of Mumbai to remember that in a city that's so deeply stressed out, if you speak to anybody from that city, it has no public space. Because Bombay is an incredibly cramped city. It has no gardens or no public spaces where people can actually just enjoy anything of the natural world. There lies a possibility in how the city can be designed that can include its natural habitats and create a space for for its citizens to actually build these connections with the natural world, and that will also really deeply impact the mental health of a city, which then in the end impacts how people belong to a city. Like I feel like we're often, now it's everything has become transient. We move to cities to make our money and leave, and in that process we've spent a large part of our lives deteriorating our health, deteriorating our mental health, our physical health. And here is a possibility that lies within a city to become incredibly connected to its natural ecosystems. And I've never understood why in its design it's never ever given that a possibility or even a chance to flourish. So that's what the project looks at, about like looking at these three dioramic worlds where citizens can or audiences can come and play, and they're all puppets that move, and they're all handmade puppets from scratch that look a lot like the universes that I've created. And I just want to bring them back to the joy of connecting to the world around them, I feel, through this work. Yeah. I'll talk about my fear first because I think about this very often. And my biggest fear is, like, it's sort of extreme, but I do feel like we will lose the idea of wilderness, of being wild, because the world is getting so overtly domesticated, particularly with the natural world and the way, like, we have capitalized on species and like on habitats, that I'm really fearing that the next generation of the natural world that is going to be reproducing, where would they go? Like, I think about elephants, I think about tigers, and these are the larger mammals that we do think about, but there's so many species just going extinct every day. And at a time where I live in the Western Ghats, which is still a largely understudied region. So we don't even know what all we have lost and what all we're going to be losing, because particularly in India, with the way the Western Ghats are being encroached upon, it is so horrifically scary. And with the way, just like, I can just speak about my country at least, so that because I wouldn't know exactly what's happening completely in the world. But with the way projects are being passed with just like no connection studies to where they're being positioned, how does it impact the local communities that depend on habitats, on just the natural world that exists and biodiversity that exists. There's just like no sense of understanding, and there's just like this blanket um, construction is just coming overnight, and there's so much more that is yet to come. Like if you study the plans of the number of ports being planned, number of highways being planned, the number of builders, just like everything is just being full throttled at a time where we have so many lessons to learn. Like, like 20 years back when these projects were being passed, maybe I could still give the benefit of doubt that, oh, we hadn't seen certain catastrophes to be like, oh, I didn't know if I build a dam, what's going to happen to a place in like a few years. But literally, I'm living in a country today where dams are overflowing, dams are breaking overnight because the drains have become erratic. There are cloud bursts. There's just like cities are flooding, and there is just like lived experience. Like most of our cities in India are currently like polluted with the worst air. We have terrible groundwater, and here we are with no conversations politically on really like how we are tackling any of these issues. All I hear constantly is just like new projects being pushed up further and further. And then there's this whole new narrative of greenwashing, which is taken in, which is just like, it's like a deep fear of mine. So starting from like this, the idea of like what happens to the idea of being wild, like what will happen to species if they lose wilderness, And that really like sends shivers down my spine sometimes. thinking about hope, it's funny, like sometimes I just wonder where does hope come from? And very often I find it like mold. I often relate it to like mold and fungi because sometimes you think like you just like things are not there, but then they just erupt in the rotting they erupt. Like if you leave a piece of great bread out there and you'll just be and in 4 days as it begins to rot, there's like a whole universe of fungi that just appears on it. So very often I think of hope like that. I do relate to hope in the mycelium network very similarly, where it just appears and then it just like thrives. And in that thriving, as like how fungi sends out its spores, we also send out our spores and we find communities and people. Like here I'm talking to you today, and like every day in my life, I meet people that also deeply inspire me and like help me keep just moving and being this small little thing in this larger thing called the world. And of course, I think one thing that has definitely brought me a lot of hope, I think, in my own personal life is being having been part of the Armchair Maulai movement for 4 years. I think this was the first time before I was a part of it, like, and it came into my life. Um, I did feel very lonely and very lost in the larger ways of things. But we're 4 years down as a citizen movement, and we have seen changes not just in our personal lives, in how the projects have shifted because of citizen action. And that has brought me such deep hope because people show up when you show up. And I think that's what's so important, to have these communities that you can nourish. And that's probably the only way forward now, like, like is to create these communities, interact with people around you, get more and more people involved, and actually take a deep dive together, not just like snorkel or just like, just float around, but actually commit to things and learn together, unlearn together. And I mean, we're all here for like a fraction of a moment, and I know the world will survive with or without us. But it kind of just makes it more nourishing when you have people around you who are also there with you in this fight. And I think that's what gives me hope, just meeting people like who are doing their own work in their own ways, and there's so many of us, so that definitely fuels a lot of like hope into my life. Last year I was actually in the Atacama Desert for a residency, and it was one of the most profound experiences of my life because I was there for almost 6 weeks in the desert, and the desert is just so vast that and we're away from all signal, electricity, like we're living like really remote. And after a while, I could feel like the desert become me and me become the desert. Like we were in sync. Like I could hear it guiding me. I could hear it talking to me. I could hear it like just like the winds were carrying whispers. And I was just like, what's happening? And I think that's what ends up happening, that when you tune off yourself from so many of the other things that we've become tuned to, and you actually start syncing with the conversations of what the natural world can speak to you, you'll realize there's so much you'll share. There's so much of a dialogue that actually will come up, and very often it can be uncomfortable, it can be glorious, it'll be a spectrum. It's not always a la la land as such. It'll make you address so many parts of yourself. And it was a really, really spectacular experience, because I haven't spent as much time in a desert as the way I did in the Atacama, and I just found it incredibly powerful what it was doing to me. And because I was also living with the Likanantai people, who are the indigenous herders of the Atacama. And it was so beautiful because every day we'd wake up and they would consider the volcanoes as their ancestors. So we would address, so your narrative, and this is where storytelling comes in, like how stories shape how we see the world around us. And it I think because I also came from a world where we consider the natural world as our ancestors, it was just so easy to sink into that relationship, where I still remember the last day when I was leaving, I almost felt like the warm embrace of the volcano bidding me goodbye. And I carry that moment really, really sacredly in my heart. One thing that I deeply also learned from nature, I would say, is interconnectedness. I think that's something I take very strongly about, how everything has a role to play and everything is shared. There is this there's this beautiful network that is so symbiotic and so balanced. And you'll often see it in many ways, even in, like in small ways, about how sharing appears in nature, about how respect appears in nature, about how interconnectedness appears in nature. Like, I'll tell you this short story. Like, there's this beautiful place in Rajasthan, where the demoiselle cranes basically come. They used to basically migrate over uh, the desert to, go ahead. But the villagers there started seeing these beautiful cranes pass by, and they were like, "Oh my God, the cranes are passing over our homeland, and they must be hungry." So the villagers started leaving food for the cranes over there, and eventually the cranes actually stopped even going ahead because they realized that, oh, this is a place with great food and water. So they started parking themselves there over the season. But what's really interesting is that there are these thousands of cranes that appear, but there's just like this tiny patch of land where the food is dispersed. And you will see the cranes have actually built a beautiful system where they go flock by flock to access the same resources. And it's so profound to watch that because, here as human beings, we're always so greedy. We're always fighting for resources, snatching away resources, taking away from each other. And here's a space where, both human, land, and an avian species come together to build this rhythm where a shared relationship is created. And today they've named their children after the birds, their songs after the birds, and there's this beautiful sense of sharing that has appeared. And it's just things like this, like there's stories like this that are just surrounded all over the world where you learn so much. So I think interconnectivity, respect, and sharing is something I think I really deeply learn from nature. I think the I think I only give one advice is that uh, inspire yourself from what's actually outside. I've seen today a lot of creators and makers. We are often relying on the internet to learn about the natural world. So, we'd Google up articles, we'd see videos, and, we do a lot of research, which is important. I do think that's important. But I think there are many inspirations that actually lie around us. So I would really encourage, like, creators and makers to first have like an experience in their physical bodies with something. Observe the world around you. Like very often I say it starts as small with just placing a water bowl in front of your window and see, like, who are the birds appearing around me, what do they look like, so get out into the real world and actually create a relationship before you make something, because we always want to build some things that are probably larger than us. So we always think that we'll create something very profound and very like larger than life, but sometimes the magic is actually just around. It could be the relationship you have with your neighborhood wildcat, or like your neighborhood crow, or or the tree that's in your yard. What is it doing? What does it look like? What is, like, just try and find inspiration with the natural world that's outside and not inside these like digital portals that exist today, the black screens, as we say. I would highly encourage that to develop that relationship first, and then from that relationship or that experience, I would say, uh, process and create what that moment did to you and why you want to make something from it.